No sleep. I competed in a game show where the contestants face their worst fears. The final round broke me. U/grotesque penguin 2D. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I stole a look over my shoulder as I watched the bushes behind me begin to part as whatever was chasing me began to emerge. Before I could catch sight of the beast, I felt my body make contact with a solid concrete wall. I winced in pain as my breath was forced out of my lungs from the impact. I crouched and slowly began to try to catch my breath. I've got to slow my heart down, I thought to myself as I began to slow my breathing down and focus on what to do next. The creature that chased me would be on my in seconds if I didn't find a way past this wall. My eyes scanned over the concrete wall that seemed to span for as far as the eye could see. My eyes soon landed on a small hole close to where I was standing. It was roughly the size of a manhole. An ear-piercing shriek sounded behind me as I looked behind me in horror. The beast was now fully emerged from its spot in the trees. From what I could see in the darkness, it looked part rodent, part arachnid, part humanoid, if that even makes sense. Needless to say, I didn't waste any time in scrambling into the little tunnel. It was barely big enough for me to crawl on my hands and knees. Hearts beating too fast, I reminded myself as I began to slow my breathing and clear my head. I then suddenly felt the walls of the tunnel begin to brush against my sides and back. I stopped for a second and realized that the tunnel was growing more narrow as it went on. The creature's screech echoed off of the tunnel walls. It must have found the entrance. I could hear its claws scraping just several feet behind me. There was no going back now. I sank to my stomach and began to army crawl forward as fast as I could. Soon it got to the point where I couldn't even fit my hands by my side anymore. In the pitch black, I couldn't see if I was heading toward a dead end or an exit. I could feel the creature behind me as its long antennae began to brush against the back of my legs. I was almost within reach. I squirmed forward, hand outstretched in front of me. My heart began to race as I suddenly noticed that there was water beginning to flow freely into the tunnel. It pooled quickly around me and I soon found myself half submerged within seconds. I lifted my head back and drew in one final breath before the water went over my head. My body suddenly stopped as I felt the walls close in around me tightly. I was stuck. My lungs burned as the last of the oxygen was spent and a searing pain shot through my body as one of the creature's claws dug into the calf of my leg. There was nothing else I could do. I closed my eyes and began to focus on slowing my heart down. Then suddenly I could hear the countdown. 10.9.8.7.6.5.3.2.1 Light suddenly erupted around me and I sat up to the sound of cheers and applause. The dome above the bed I was lying in lifted and I stood to my feet. I stood on a stage surrounded by cameras. There were several domes around me, all but one of them empty. From the only other occupied one contained a burly figure who also stood to his feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed over the speakers. "I give you our final contestants." The game was simple. The contestants were to lie onto their backs in what we referred to as the dome. While inside, we would be put into a coma-like state while small electrodes were gently placed on our temples and chests. The ones on our chest were attached to a Holter monitor, and the ones on our temples came from a neurostimulator, all done by professionals, of course. While inside the simulation, we would be put into several scenarios for 5 minutes at a time. Each scenario would be based on our worst fears. While inside the simulation, our heart's rate would be closely monitored and if it were to reach over 110.1 beats per minute, we would be forcefully ejected out of the simulation and automatically forfeit the match. The entire simulation would be projected in the big screen for the audience to watch from our point of view. If the contestant was ejected, the screen would fade to black to the sound of a comical chicken clucking echoed through the speakers, much to the amusement of the crowd. There were 9 levels altogether, 1 being silly childhood fears and 9 being 5 minutes in actual hell. I remembered the first one for me. I was standing in a dark basement of an abandoned basement as hundreds of rats scampered across the floor around my feet. The occasional one darting up the side of my leg or leaping onto my sweat-stained body. This was a recurring nightmare I used to have, based on a childhood memory when I accidentally disturbed a rat's nest after being dared to go into the abandoned basement of my friend's house. Although the sight immediately made me uneasy, I didn't get as worked up as I expected. The simulations that preceded went on as such. Walking through a pitch-black tunnel, strange whispers echoed across the walls. Climbing up a steep ladder so high off the ground, I could barely see anything from above the clouds. Lying paralyzed as dozens of centipedes crept over my bare skin. Being stranded in the open ocean as dark figures circled me and occasionally nudged and tugged on my feet. All based on fears and phobias I used to have in the past. The dark, heights, centipedes, and the open ocean. By the end of the 5th simulation, only 10 contestants remained who didn't chicken out. The next ones were a little more than unsettling. They were downright gruesome. The 6th one, I found myself tied to a bed at a dingy hospital as doctors began to perform surgery on me while I was still conscious. I lay there paralyzed, unable to move as I felt the scalpel dig into my soft flesh as they slowly made the incision. It all felt so real. The one after that, I found myself standing in a frozen lake with my niece who suddenly fell through the ice. As I ran to her aid, the hole that she fell through immediately became frozen over as I began to pound the ice with my bare fists over and over again until my knuckles bled. The whole time watching her as she slowly sank further and further out of sight. That one nearly did me in. At first, it was embarrassing knowing that the audience had a full view of the simulations. The last few were very personal, and I tried to not let it bother me. I suffer from chronic scoliosis, which is a condition that causes a small curvature of the spine. Every 5 years I need to undergo surgery to correct it, so I always dreaded hospitals and doctors. My niece was 6 years old when she drowned after falling through thin ice at a lake where my family used to enjoy ice skating during the winter. I felt violated afterward, like my worst fears and memories were suddenly opened up for the world to see for their entertainment. Yet I still pressed on. After the 8th simulation that played on my crippling claustrophobia, only me and one other contestant remained. His name was Ray, a supposedly fearless competitor who I believe used to serve as a Marine. I never knew I would make it this far, and my ability to control my heart rate and remain calm even in the most horrific circumstances surprised the audience just as much as I surprised myself. Maybe those breathing techniques I learned while coping with my anxiety came in handy. Or perhaps it was sheer will alone that helped me get by. After everything I have been through, all the failures and heartbreaks I endured, I was determined to win. I had never truly been good at anything until I entered into this contest. Don't get me wrong, there are not many things I was terrible at, but I always found myself as mediocre at most with everything I tried. Sports, school, hobbies, I could never really find anything truly excelled in. I was never truly good at anything. Up until now, that is. This was my once chance to prove to myself that I had what it takes to show the world that I am a man without fear. I am able to face my fears to win this contest. None of this is real, so nothing could truly hurt me, right? What did I have to lose? The crowd went wild as the host announced the final contestants who would face off in this final challenge. The 9th stage was unknown to everyone in the room, as only a few contestants had ever made it this far in previous seasons, and when they did, the simulation was made private so that the audience could not see it. The screens were blacked out for this simulation, showcasing only the words "the truth" to the live audience. As I entered the dome for the last time, I looked over to Ray, who gave me a confident yet sportsmanlike nod. As I lay onto my back as the technician began to place the electrodes to my body, I wondered what the final simulation could be. Would I be skinned alive by a masked serial killer? Would I be falling head over heels into a dark and endless pit? Or would I find myself face to face with myself, facing the truth that I'm my own worst fear? My heart rate began to pick up as my mind raced at the possibilities. "Take it easy," I murmured to myself as I began to slowly inhale through my nose and exhale from my mouth. "You've got this," I told myself as I felt myself slowly begin to drift away, ready to face the truth. Light flooded my vision. As my consciousness entered the simulation, I tensed up, ready for anything, expecting horrors beyond comprehension. My eyes darted about, taking in my surroundings. To my confusion, I discovered the complete opposite. I stood in the middle of a clearing surrounded by lush vegetation. A gentle breeze blew through the branches and the sun warmed my skin. I relaxed slightly and took in a deep breath. To my amazement, the air tasted sweet and just the feeling of it inside of my lungs filled me with a renewed energy I had not felt before. I took one step forward, my bare feet brushing across the soft grass. It was then I noticed something completely different. The all-too-familiar dull ache in my lower back was gone. I slowly reached behind me and ran my hand down the small of my back. The skin was smooth, I felt no scar tissue from the countless surgeries. I placed my hands on my hips and leaned back slightly. There was no pain at all, not even the slightest bit of discomfort. Over the years I have grown almost accustomed to that pain, and this was the first time since I could remember the pain wasn't there. It felt great. My mind raced. How was this possible? Did I die during the simulation? Was this the afterlife? I then noticed something else. I no longer felt the overbearing weight of my depression and anxiety. Negative thoughts and insecurities were no longer in the back of my mind. I couldn't recall a single bad feeling or painful memory at all. I felt a tear fall from my eye. I wasn't sad, I felt the complete opposite. For the first time in a long time, I genuinely felt happy. I felt at peace with myself and everything around me. With a burst of sudden energy, I found myself running out of the clearing and into the forest. My heart pumped faster as I felt a burst of adrenaline. I have never run this fast before. As I ran through the forest, I took in all the beauty that surrounded me. The earth here was different. Different in a way I can't even describe. As I ran, the earth changed around me. One moment it was a lush forest with green leaves and colorful flowers surrounding me. The next moment I was on a mountaintop. I could see the clouds below me from where I sprinted as lightning and thunder light them up in blinding flashes of blue lights. The next I was on a beach with cool water slashing around my ankles. Next, I was by a river, surrounded by towering waterfalls. The mist felt cool and refreshing on my skin as I continued to run, faster and faster than before. It was then that I found the entrance to a cave. I slowed down to a stop before I stepped inside. I don't know what caused me to go in. I felt like it was just calling to me, like there was something inside I was meant to see. As I walked forward, the light faded into complete darkness. I stopped suddenly as my hand brushed across the back of the cave. Turning around to head back, I was then surprised to see a dim light began to fill the inside of the cavern. As I looked around me, I saw thousands of lights begin to pierce the darkness. Small translucent glow worms covered the walls and the ceiling of the cave, their small lights shining like thousands of stars and galaxies. I just stood there taking in the surrounding beauty. I felt like I was at the center of the universe. I felt like I was on top of the world. I felt like I was in heaven. I never wanted it to end. It was then I heard a distant voice. 50 seconds, the voice said. I snapped out of my trance and looked around me in confusion. One by one, the glowing lights began to fade out as the darkness began to creep back in. 40 seconds, the voice said. The countdown, I thought by myself. I was still in the simulation. 30 seconds, I heard louder this time. My heart began to race as I all of a sudden felt panic begin to set in. No, I was not ready to leave. I wanted to stay here. 20 seconds, the voice droned as the darkness began to creep closer and closer. No, I shouted in fear. No, you can't make me go back. 10 seconds, the voice said indifferently. No, I screamed again as the last of the lights began to fade out. I'm not ready to go back. You can't make me go back. The voice began to count down from 10 to 1. I reached out in desperation, trying to catch the last of the fading lights before it was snuffed out, but it was too late. I pounded against the cave walls with all my strength, screaming until my lungs felt raw, my heart pounding in my chest. After everything I had been through, my worst fear was the thought of returning to reality. I sat up in a panic. I shielded my eyes as the lights from the stage blinded me temporarily. I felt a sharp pain as I sat up from my lower back. We have ourselves a winner. The voice of the announcer boomed through the speakers as the crowd got out of their seats and cheered. I began to sweat as the dream fully faded away and reality slowly sank in. All of my pain, my discomfort, all of my negative thoughts seemed to be amplified as I could barely stand up out of the dome. The air tasted bitter and smelled sour. The room was hot and muggy. The floor below my feet felt hard and uncomfortable. As the announcer stepped forward to congratulate me with an outstretched hand, I reached out and grasped him by the front of the shirt. "Send me back," I begged him. "I wasn't finished yet." "No, you weren't," he said, half laughing, "but you were seconds away from the 5-minute mark. That's a record." "You don't understand," I shouted. "I can't take it anymore. Please send me back." I began to wrap my hands around his throat in anger. I was then jerked back and was roughly put into a chokehold. I threw my head back in retaliation, feeling it collide with a burly security guard's face. His grip loosened slightly, and I fell face first onto the ground. The crowd began to murmur nervously as I scrambled toward the dome. I grasped the electrodes and clumsily began to try to stake them back to my temples. It was then I felt a sharp pain shoot through my body as the guard fired his stun gun right between my shoulders. As my trashing body hit the ground, I noticed movement from the other side of the stage. A group of medical staff and first responders crowded around Ray's dome. The last thing I remember before I passed out was Ray's lifeless eyes as they loaded his limp body onto a stretcher and began to rush him off the stage. The showrunners made a public statement shortly afterward, publicly apologizing to the viewers and explaining that what they witnessed was not an effect of their machines. It was a mental breakdown due to Tommy medical history. Ray was DOA when we reached the hospital. I overheard the doctors saying it was caused by a ventricular fibrillation during the simulation. For those of you without a medical degree, it means the Marine was scared to death. I was released a few days later. I received an apology letter from the executives of the show along with my prize money. They added a few zeros to the amount as compensation for any sort of trauma I might have experienced during the simulation. I knew hush money when I saw it. Since that day, I feel like I live in constant agony. An agony every one of you feels every single day but may not be aware of it. A pain you have all grown accustomed to because it is all you know. A pain you only realize that exists when you have lived 5 minutes without it. You don't know the truth. Life is pain. Every second of our existence. I spend my days longing to return to that simulation. That place where pain does not exist and my mind is at ease. Sometimes in my dreams, I can catch a glimpse of it for a few seconds before I am quickly thrown back into consciousness. I guess Gibran was right when he said, "Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding."